Today, we have the distinct honor to host as our keynote speaker, Kabir Helminski, who represents a path that values the oneness of all beings and strives for unity through an appreciation of diversity. Kabir Helminski, Sufi teacher, author, and co-director of Threshold Society, a nonprofit educational foundation rooted within the traditions of Sufism and inspired by the life and work of Mevlana Jalaleddin Rumi, with the purpose of facilitating the experience of divine unity, love, and truth in the world. The Threshold Society is affiliated with the Mevlana Foundation, recognized by UNESCO as the authentic representative of the Mevlevi tradition. Kabir Helminski will be accompanied by Threshold Society dervishes and Selcuk Gurez, who is joining us from Turkey, whose offerings will bring us closer to the artistic expressions of an 800 years old living tradition devoted to love, a tradition which may be familiar to most through the poetry of Rumi, and whose historic spaces of gathering are accessible to all as living museums in Turkey. Kabir Helminski has explored the sacred traditions of the world, seeking to understand what they can teach us about consciousness and the human heart. The focus of his work is contributing to a new language of spirituality to meet the unprecedented challenges of our times. His books on spirituality, living presence, and the knowing heart have been published in at least 8 languages, most recently in Turkish. He is a respected translator of the works of Rumi and others. In 2019, Kabir Helminski was named as one of the 500 most influential Muslims in the world. He has toured North America as sheikh with the whirling dervishes of Turkey, bringing Sufi culture to more than 100,000 people. I was one of those lucky 100,000. In 1993, when Kabir Helminski led a group of dervishes in a traditional ceremony at the George Washington University's Listener Auditorium. As a homesick foreign student, this was an incredible gift, which continues to keep giving. It is with heartfelt gratitude I invite Kabir Helminski to share his gifts of wisdom with us today as we begin our explorations of empathy in our humble gathering. As we transition into the keynote remarks, let's take a 5-minute break and perhaps make yourself a cup of tea and get ready to explore our universe through the eye of the heart. Welcome again. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Elif, for welcoming us all. As Elif mentioned, let's take a 5-minute break and we will come back and welcome our keynote speaker. We'll see you all in 5 minutes. And welcome back, everyone. It is a delight to welcome our keynote speaker, Kabir Dede.
Thank you. I'm honored, so honored to be here with all of you. And could we, if we're beginning, could we have slide number 1? Yes, so this is good. Pardon me. The title of our talk today, Qualitative Space and the Human Experience of Value. How can we enhance the museum experience? So I come from a tradition which for about 8 centuries has worked in the area of what I'll call human development, spiritual development, based in experience, not in beliefs, also based in community and community relationships. And Greg, we can take the slide off now. When you enter into a Sufi lodge, a traditional Sufi lodge, you step across a threshold And you're in a different space. You've moved from the space of the world into sacred space. I remember once a conversation I had with one of our colleagues in Turkey, and he posed the question, well, really, what is the difference between sacred space and non-sacred or worldly or commercial or secular space? I didn't really have an answer. And he said, in sacred space, everything there has an intention. Everything serves a purpose. If you think about it, you walk into a Catholic church and you see a basin of water. Do we know what that's for? What could that be? Well, it's the baptismal font. Behind that actual physical thing is a theology, a faith, or consider the Hanukkah menorah, 8 candles. According to some, 7 candles represent the natural laws of this existence, and the 8th candle represents something beyond, points beyond this material existence. I remember once an interesting story when I was traveling in Turkey with a group of people, and we were visiting a Sufi lodge, and one of our friends, who's actually an interesting person, it was Kramer from Seinfeld, who was with us. And Kramer is a little bit goofy sometimes, and he was looking up at this massive picture of a huge sword. Really, it's more like a scimitar, and it was surrounded by roses. And he points to it and whispers to me and says, well, what's that sword about? And I said, well, let's ask the people in charge. And it was a woman, Sheikha, who was the head of this lodge. And we asked her, tell us about this sword and these roses. And she said, the roses are what we offer the outer world, and the sword is what we wield against our own egoism. So sacred space offers the possibility of symbols, metaphors, indications of intentionality. And I propose to you that your museum space is something like a sacred space. And when people enter this space, they step across the threshold. And what will be offered to them? In the public world, in our big cities today, it's really a free-for-all of many forces competing for our attention, not the least of which are the commercial messages and images, which sometimes we even wear on our own bodies. We become walking advertisements. And there are a few public spaces that are free of this incoherent messaging. Set yourself the task someday, walking through a big city and attempting to remember your human heart, the purpose of your life, the fact that one day you will be gone from this material world, and to focus on what is most essential in your own being as you walk down a city street, and see what is calling for your attention in this urban environment. How do we maintain presence in the midst of store windows and billboards and brands everywhere? So, when we speak of the sacred, we don't necessarily mean religious belief. Every human being who's not a psychopath holds something sacred. For some, it's nature. For some, it may be beauty. For others, it may be fairness and justice. Perhaps our museums and other cultural institutions could keep in mind the values that are essential to our humanness, especially in this time, in these days, when our humanness itself is really being challenged, being threatened by so many forces. For years, I was a speaker at a conference called Science and Non-Duality. And this is where I met dear Elif. And at this ongoing conference over the years, people were very excited about the new developments, or not so new developments, in science and physics and cutting edge biology, etc. And people were finding in the sciences beautiful metaphors that seemed to resonate or seemed to be, in some ways, confirm the insights of great traditional mystics. So the physical universe was echoing something in the human soul. I'd like to offer us a little, I'll call it a little map of reality, a short lesson in metaphysics. And by metaphysics, I'm not talking about unverifiable aspects of a higher reality. I'm really referring to the metaphysics of our own experience. So the dominant orthodoxy of our time is science. Could we have slide number 2? And science is based on quantitative reality and mathematics. Science is based on what we can measure, both at the macrocosmic level, and next slide, please, and also at the microcosmic level of quantum energies. So both from the quantum level to the vast domain of relativity theory, it is often described, which, yes, that's number 2 or 3, wherever we are. Science has developed through extraordinary persistence and instrumentation, a knowledge of reality. But what about our humanness itself? Is it possible that the human being also has instruments for investigating what I'm calling a qualitative reality? Now, somehow we jump to this slide. You see, if you look carefully, I was trying to make a point that you see the galaxies and you see the roses. The roses were meant to represent that qualitative dimension of values, of relationships, of meaning, of beauty. And the simple point I'm trying to make here is that we human beings are creatures that live in 2 realities at the same time. You could say one reality imposed upon another. The reality represented perhaps somewhat sentimentally as roses, indicating beauty, love, relationship. And the stars, the vast cosmos, representing that other universe explored by scientific instrumentation. So let's say our concern here is, how can we cultivate this capacity within the human being? How can we cultivate this instrument of the heart, which I propose to you is our foremost cognitive instrument for knowing the world qualitatively, not just quantitatively. Quantitative science can measure the effect on our physiology. It can demonstrate that with compassion, brain waves undergo certain changes, with fear, other kinds of changes, but it can never really tell us what that experience is. Okay, let's take down this slide, Greg. So we're living in this world, this reality that is both qualitative and quantitative, both existing simultaneously. But I propose to you that the real action is at the qualitative level. That in fact, everything that is most important to a human being is invisible. And that human consciousness itself has not yet been explained by science. It's a given. Everything happens, including science, within human consciousness. But human consciousness, especially in its qualitative dimension, is explored with an instrument, which I will call the heart. Not just the brain. The brain thinks about things, formulates things, but it's what we're metaphorically calling the heart that perceives empathy, unity, compassion, and also where we experience these subtle but incredibly important values of what it means, for instance, to live with integrity, or what it means to live a truly human life, a truly purposeful life, and not just a life preoccupied with things. So I'm going to invite us to have you might say, a taste of qualitative perception, as I invite our friend Selcuk Gurez, who we consider a living cultural treasure, to play for us some music, a kind of music that developed within the Sufi lodge of our tradition over centuries. And this is a music that conveys a quality that I leave it to you to experience. So please listen for a few minutes with your heart. Welcome, dear brother. So good to see you.
Thank you, Dada. Eyvallah.
Thank you, dear brother. So this is an example of the kind of music that developed within the culture of the Sufi lodges. In a way, it takes you into the inner life, the soul of these dervishes, Sufis. If you were to visit the tomb of Rumi in Konya, Turkey today, you would hear the music of the ney pumped in through the sound system, and you would be, I think, forever imprinted with the beauty of this breath, of this soaring, non-repeating, continuous, improvised melody of the soul. So I hope this brings you a little more into that qualitative dimension. For centuries, our particular tradition had centers all over the Middle East, North Africa, from North Africa to Iraq, really. And these centers were met with certain the catastrophes of the 20th century and the secularization of countries in the Middle East. And at that time, all of these centers were converted into museums or historical sites. So we are a tradition where our real estate has been appropriated, but fortunately it's being preserved. At least these places exist as places one can visit and appreciate, even if the living spirit is sometimes absent. Our tradition has a ceremony called Sema, also called the whirling ceremony, which is an incredible integration of a classical music repertoire, choral music with a classical ensemble, a choreography of whirlers, we call them semazens, people who turn, and all of this within the intention of coming to our deepest center, where we're closest to the divine reality. In order to whirl like this, one needs to be empty inside and hyper aware. This is not trance. This is an exercise in the intention of being empty and clear within, and at the same time being part of a ceremony that conveys the energy of this state of pure presence. So, Greg, we're going to, can we go to the video portion we selected? For just a few minutes, I want to show you a ceremony that we led. We were part of a couple of years ago in Istanbul, and let you see, again, the beautiful space, centuries old, from the 15th century, but remodeled in the 18th century. This is now a museum. Great. This ceremony, we have two sheikhs, myself, and a Turkish sheikh. As our whirlers were from the west and from the east. Reviewing the very end of the ceremony. And then the two sheikhs enter into the center briefly. And the whirlers continue whirling, while a single instrument improvises and all you hear is the swish of their robes and feet. Could we have a little more volume? A sacred moment. It is the end of the alchemy of the ceremony. Chant of remembrance begins, chanting the name of God. Actually, many members of Rumi's family sitting in the background here, grandsons, third generation, direct descendants of Rumi with us that day. Name of God, the infinitely compassionate and infinitely merciful. That's good. Thank you, Greg. And the words in Arabic are saying, to God belongs the east and the west, and wheresoever you turn is the face of God. So this was the life of the Mevlevi dervishes. This ceremony was performed weekly, and guests were welcome. We made a space for guests, so it's not just for people within the order. And this particular site was written about over the centuries by European visitors. Now, I'd like to share with you a reading of a ghazal, that is a lyric poem by Rumi, which is called Intermixed. And I think it captures something of what we've been talking about, the nature of human life, of the qualitative and the quantitative dimension of life, of the heart-soul dimension of human experience, and at the same time, our embodiment in this material reality, and how these two things go together. So you'll be hearing a translation of mine of this ghazal, as well as a bit of the original Persian, and it's being read to us by Leila, who is both a Sufi and a scientist. Welcome, Leila.
Thank you. See how love became intermixed with the lovers. See how the spirit and the clay are intermixed. How often are you going to see this and that, good and evil, In the end, see how all of this and that are intermixed. How long will you say the known and the unknown? See how that both are intermixed. How often do you talk about this physical world and the other? See that the two are intermixed. The heart appears like the king, and the brain is its interpreter. See how the king and the interpreter are intermixed. Let both be mixed. It's for your own sake that this earth and heaven are intermixed. See the fire and see the water. See the air and see the earth. Enemies they are, but as friends when intermixed. The gazelle and the lion, the ewe and the wolf are four opposites, but when they sense the hunter near, are all intermixed. What a sovereign ruler! In this garden, with grace and order, flowers and thorns intermix. See the unity in the creation and know that autumn and early spring are intermixed. Even though all these opposites seem to clash, as an arrow needs a bow, all are intermixed. Stop blaming, be silent, and chew some sweet candy. As in the mouth, sugar and censure are intermixed. عشق بین با عاشقان آمیخته، روح بین با خاکدان آمیخته. چند بینی این و آن و نیک و بد، بنگر آخر این و آن آمیخته. اندر آمیزید زیرا بهر ماست این زمین و آسمان آمیخته. آنچنان شاهی نگر کز لطف او خار و گل در گلستان آمیخته. قند خواه خاموش باش و حیف دان، قند و پند اندر دهان آمیخته. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila. How beautiful. All right, so as we know, museum curators are dealing with extraordinary artifacts. And I'd like to present to you an artifact and have you just glance at it for a minute or so. Could we have, let's see, this is slide number 10. Here we are. So what do we see here? What, if anything, is expressed in this artifact? I stumbled across this maybe 15 years ago. What it is, my friends, it is a carving in mammoth tusk ivory. It is the oldest known representation of the human visage. It is 26,000 years old. And I've been looking for 15 years, will anything be discovered older than this? You know, if we go back even further in history, there's magnificent art, but it's always animals on the cave paintings, for instance. And they never have the human face. If they have figures at all, they're human figures, sometimes very rudimentary, but never with the face. 26,000 years is also the cycle known as the precession of the equinoxes, meaning every 26,000 years. Right now we have the constellation of Aquarius rising at the equinox. 26,000 years ago, a full cycle earlier, we had this first appearance of what I would call a new level of human self-awareness. There's some evidence to suggest that this 26,000-year-old cycle marks evolutionary cycles in human history. You can go back more than 100,000 years and 50-some thousand years and notice significant changes. 26,000 years ago, somebody somewhere was moved to create this carving of the human face. Might it be possible that in this day, in this era, human beings might possibly be rising to a new level of self-awareness? We can hope so. So, by the way, this was discovered in what is today the Czech Republic. And this is one of our ancestors, one of your ancestors. So I come to you today from beyond some of the cultural assumptions of our society and the themes that we've explored so far, that the human being inhabits two dimensions: qualitative dimension of meaning, value. We have a nearly infinite vocabulary of qualities, of emotional nuance, of perceptions of beauty, which the human heart has given birth to in our human linguistics. At the same time, we have this amazing development of science and engineering. Can our human soul side keep pace with our scientific, technological side? What can cultural institutions do to enhance our experience of humanness? How might we intentionally create a space to optimize this qualitative dimension, this human soul experience? And how can a visit to a museum or any other cultural institution teach us more about humanness and touch our hearts and souls? Could these be intentions for the space that you hold? Can you take these few simple ideas, and I realize I'm probably explaining something in a way is very obvious once we get it, and yet what would it be like if we were literally cultivating this human capacity to perceive qualitatively? What if we truly valued this inner soul experience? And we're not necessarily talking about anything supernatural. We're not talking in terms of any religious beliefs. We're talking within the experience of every human being, where what is most precious, what is most meaningful is this inner dimension of value. that includes empathy, compassion, friendship, aspiration, human integrity, justice, peace. How can we cultivate this? So, Greg, we can take down our friend here, who, by the way, I think is a woman, unless they were shaving 26,000 years ago. One of our mothers. You all are certainly related to her. So now we're going to end with a living expression of our tradition. We will see 3 semizens turning, as we say, and they'll be turning to some music of our composition, a modern-day contemporary expression rooted in traditions of Sufi culture. And we are so grateful to be with you today and to have a chance to reflect on some of these beauties and on the fact of humanness itself. That perhaps we can appreciate the possibilities of fostering, of cultivating a deep humanism in this time, a humanism that is profoundly spiritual because it orients us to our own hearts. So now we shall begin with a few minutes of whirling and some contemporary Sufi music.
Greatest love may be most painful, truly innocent and most shameful. Didn't they tell you, didn't they ever tell you, I should have told you, didn't they ever tell you? Sweetest morsel can't be swallowed, the straightest path can't be followed. Didn't they tell you, didn't they ever tell you, I should have told you, didn't they ever tell you? Shirt is sleeveless, has no collar, you're to wear it now and hereafter. Didn't they tell you, didn't they ever tell you, I should have told you, didn't they ever tell you?
Well, dear friends, that's what we have to offer for today. I hope it perhaps stimulates some new thoughts about a subject you're already deeply immersed in. And I thank Elif and everyone involved for offering us this opportunity to share with you today.
Dada, thank you so much for this conversation, for our dervish sisters and brothers. Thank you so much for your participation, and Selcuk Gurez from Turkey, who joined us with the reed flute. Your collaboration, your presence made this gathering so enriching and so valuable, and gave us a taste of what it would be like, perhaps if we were in Turkey or in Konya or in Istanbul, in one of those lodges that are now museums, and we could be experiencing this all together in the same space. And thank you, Dada. Thank you. And
Thank you.
and so I believe we have time for some Q&A, and we would love to have your questions, and I will leave it to Greg to start moderating that. And Greg, thank you so much for coordinating all the different elements. You know, we really tried to do something.
Well, I don't know how well I did on part of it, but it was a delight to experience it all with you. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
And so we open it up to some question and answer, either in the chat box if you prefer to type something in, or if you would prefer to unmute your microphone and turn on your video and engage with us, we would most certainly welcome that as well. So feel free just to, if you want to do that, just jump into the conversation. It's very informal and conversational.
Hi, my name's Monique Davis. I'm from Jackson, Mississippi, the Mississippi Museum of Art. We were just having a conversation about the hierarchy often present in museums and how embedded the worship of the artist and the object is. And I'm wondering, even in curatorial professional development experiences, how do we rehumanize the artist and put him on equal footing with him or her, or they, on equal footing with the community, and make that be a dialogue instead of a hierarchical conversation?
I'm not sure, Monique, if this is addressed to me or not, but I'm here, so I will try to take it. I think you're pointing to a cultural problem, and maybe even a particularly Western or modern problem, because we know that in some cultures, in traditional cultures, artistry is not necessarily associated with ego promotion. You know, and for instance, in Bali, where you have extraordinary artistry, and they don't have a word for art, and people collaborate on paintings, and nobody's special because they're a painter. Everybody is talented. In our own tradition, humility was so built into the whole system that it's part of what we call the adab, the decorum of the tradition, that everyone, both the teachers and the learners, the sheikh and the dervishes, attempt to approach each other with humility. So I think your question, which is also my question in this culture, is how do we cultivate this humility and modesty in our culture? How do we ourselves embody it? And it's a big, large cultural problem, because today, you know, our tradition talks about idolatries, talks about don't worship idols, orient yourself towards the divine reality, or orient yourself towards what is real and true, and don't make idols. Well, what are our idols today? Our idols are the idols of celebrity, aren't they? Whether it be in sports or the arts or entertainment. So we have a cultural issue here. And this is part of what I was talking about when I was saying we have a cultural work to do. If we don't save the culture, what will be left? And if we don't honor human beings as human beings and honor artists for teaching us something about humanness, and not all artists do that. Am I right? I mean, there are trends in art today that are maybe taking us in a different direction than the one we might want to go in. So thank you, Monique. I don't know if that's an adequate answer, but it's a great question.
Thank you so much, Monique. And a bit of a shift, Dahlia, as you recall when we were planning this, the art behind you is so perfect and evocative. I wonder if you might share a little bit about it, because Marta noticed it and wanted to know if there's some significance to it.
I think you mean Layla.
Layla, so sorry.
Dedejan, if I may. Yes, this calligraphy says, Ya Hazrat Maulana Muhammad Jalaluddin Rumi, Quddas Ruhul Ali. And the shape is in the shape of the hats.
Death Star. It's called the Death Star.
Yes, Death Star it's called. That you sign the head of the dervishes as they were whirling. So this is the significance of Molavi order dervishes, shape and honoring our Maulana. But Dedejan, please.
Well, also it says, to translate it from its Arabic, it says, "Oh, His Presence, our Master, Jalaluddin Rumi, may God preserve his secret." And the secret is the secret at the heart of every human being, where we are closest to God. That's how we understand it.
Thank you so much. And I certainly welcome anybody in the audience who has a comment or an observation. Perhaps Lottie, you have something you want to add here. I know that you were reflecting on the our capacity to perceive qualitatively and to perceive the inner soul experience. Anything you want to add to that?
Greg, thank you for calling me out, but there's nothing to add. It's just a beautiful question.
Thanks, Lottie. And a number of people really in the comment box, as you can see, just really appreciated the experience, the calming and deep experience of it, which in itself seems to reflect exactly what you've been sharing with us, Kabir Dede.
Thank you. Well, maybe it's an experience of openness, and maybe there's something to be applied to the possible experience within a museum and how that experience might be cultivated. And it would need to be done, with aesthetic finesse, without imposing our meanings on people, but without allowing somehow people to open up to what's there, as I hope we did when we saw the 26,000-year-old woman.
Well, as a museum professional myself, in seeing that 26,000-year-old visage, it made me pause to think, because when I talk to my students, for example, about the role of museums, and that role is to tell the story of the world in which we live and the diverse peoples with whom we share the planet, past, present, and future. You certainly took us very far into the past, and yet your comment about somebody's mother, really all of us connected, was a very powerful statement.
Well, it was powerful realization for me as well. And here's an example of something where the date does matter. The information matters. Context matters. And at the same time, just to be able to witness silently the work of a 26,000-year-old human being, and to have it with us today.
Thank you.
Greg, if I may, Greg.
Yes, Elif.
I was thinking, in a museum experience, and I don't know if that artifact is displayed somewhere or is in a private collection, but it is usually the label would just say the date, probably, and where it was found, maybe the dimensions and what it was made of, but would greatly lack the context which you have provided. And in a way, when you mentioned, imagine museums as spaces, sacred space, you're going in on a journey begins. So we are the narrators of that journey. We can build what we want people to leave with. Do we want just to give them information? Do we just put objects and artists on pedestal, just Monique said? Or do we provide them with that kind of context, but with the intention to instill some humility, some of the qualities that you mentioned, empathy, compassion, friendship, sense of justice and fairness, beyond the shapes and the textures and the senses.
Yes. Thank you.
Elif, as you're talking, it makes me think of one of the things we understand generally about why people come to museums and what their intention is for their experience, and that often people are coming for a cognitive experience. They want to learn something or build on something they already know, or they're coming for a social experience. They're coming with their family, their friends, their school group, and people are coming for an affective or emotional or spiritual experience. So if we know that our visitors are coming, our participants are coming to the museum experience with any and all of these entrance narratives, then it occurs to me what you just said is our responsibility to help provide that. If we know that people are looking for a spiritual or an affective, emotional experience, how can we help provide that for them?
In a way, I think I'm thinking more like, not about what people are looking for, but what we are about, really. I mean, what are we really presenting? I mean, people look for all kinds of things, but are we about just that, which may be just perfectly fine, just to focus on that and provide all of that? Or I wonder sometimes that we might need some different type of design, different type of space that we may need to invent for our public use that provides just, or focuses on this type of, qualitative experience.
I want to enter in here, but I also want to remark that Philip Hinberg had his hand up. But let me just say a brief comment. We produced and led several tours of the whirling dervishes of Turkey around North America and even India. And in one of those tours, I think it was the second tour, where we got an idea. We decided that, and by the way, these were in fairly large venues, averaging 1,000, sometimes 2,000 people, in university venues and cathedrals. But for one of our tours, we positioned people, ushers, in the aisles, and they were holding, we bought in Turkey these silver, I don't know what to call them, Elif, but they hold rose water. They're little decanters they're not that little, of rose water. And everybody that came to the performance was offered rose water in their hands, which back in those days, you could do that. I'm not sure we could do it today. In those days, everybody was offered rose water, and people trusted us enough to take the rose water, and the whole audience of 1,000 or so people, well, everything was smelling like roses. Yeah.
And Philip, thank you. Philip, I think you had something you wanted to add here.
Yeah, I'm finding this conversation really interesting. I'm not per se a museum person, but when I watch the dervishes, it's sort of more in my world, which is theater and performance. And my question that you're just addressing is, and Elif spoke about this a bit, a piece of art that's in a museum, how much does that piece of art speak for itself? And how much does it want and need context? And if it does, where is the artist, if the artist is alive, let's say, in that decision making, how the art is presented, what the environment around that piece of art is, or what it's next to, for example. And if the artist is deceased, how does the curator, I'm asking this of all of you curators, how does the curator decide how they present not just the piece of art, but the intention of the artist, if in fact the intention of the artist is part of the responsibility of the museum curator?
Well, I know that we have several museum colleagues in our audience, and I encourage any of you who have some thoughts about this to share. Kirsten, I know that you have some thoughts. Elaine, perhaps some thoughts as well.
I wanted to, and let me incorporate Philip's notion. I was struck by the poem Intermix, because one of the things museums don't do well, which the poem did well, which was to hold the opposites intact and suggesting at a different plane that they could be incorporated, rather than making a mush, which we tend to do in our label, in which we say some pablum-like thing that takes all the edges off. And what Philip is talking about as well is some multiple track, unreconciled way of doing our exhibitions, which I write about and think about, which would leave the artist's intention intact, but would add other intentions. So the poem Intermix was, for me, a symbol of the work we could be doing, which was to hold the opposites with all their edges intact and still see their relational stuff, rather than trying to get them to conform to each other.
Beautiful, Elaine. I just want to comment about something about the nature of the heart and what we understand by the heart. And I'm not talking about, a sentimental organ, an emotion, not even an organ of mere emotionality, but that the human being has this capacity to hold the opposites, to take it all in, and to know that this
Yeah.
beauty and this terror are all part of the same thing and are intermixed in that way. And we learn from all of it. We learn about the human condition from seeing the whole panorama of human life. So thank you for your comments, Elaine. Appreciated them.
And Elaine, this might be a bit of a stretch, but when you were describing this, it made me think of the leitmotif of your writing, the power of and, that what we do in the museum doesn't have to be either or, it doesn't have to be excellence or equity, for example. It's and I know you've written and spoken about this power of and in many contexts over the years.
Right. And if we concentrate on people are writing things like yin and yang, where we understand a symbol keeps the edges and creates the whole. If we concentrate on this notion of, it's also the heart currently of complexity theory, that there's a way of concentrating on keeping differing opinions inside different worldviews inside the museum and still see our common humanity in that. And that's a technique, I hope, that would come and mimic this Rumi poem, which I found exactly the thing I'm looking for about keeping not only the opposites, but the people who hold the opposites in our frame. So I found it very, very helpful, and thank you.
And Kirsten Latham, I know that you offered a few comments here in the chat box, very thoughtful comments. Wondering if you wanted to share some of your thinking with us.
Sure.
Feel free to unmute.
Sure, I can't share my camera. It's not letting me, but I guess you don't need to look at me. You can look at my Mona Kirsten. Yeah, I'm in the middle of teaching a class called Well-Being in Cultural Organizations. And so we're constantly thinking about a whole person approach. And so I think there's some relationship here to that approach of the whole person. There we go. Thanks, Greg. There I am. Hi, I'm a real person. So, and you're all mentioning these bits and pieces of what the whole person is. And it's, it's not a spectrum. It's not a this and a that. It's, we walk into a museum as someone who maybe is looking for an intellectual thing, but also maybe spiritual, maybe occupational. I mean, we can't say every single person who walks through the door has all of these things. And so one of the things I was saying was that we are constantly maybe working towards one of those instead of multiple of those. And then people might leave dissatisfied because maybe they're not getting fulfilled by the other aspects. And this is kind of a structured way to think about it, a little more structured than I'd like to, but I just think it's interesting to constantly reflect on whole person as an intention at the beginning of creating a space in a museum or creating a journey in a museum.
And Kirsten, while we've got you on the screen, I know that you write and do a lot of research into museology and the paradigm that is our field. Mm-hmm. But I see you also commented here in regards to what Elaine said about complexity theory and mm-hmm. how complexity theory could be a really good approach for museums to dig into. Thoughts
Absolutely.
about that?
Oh yeah, lots of thoughts about that. I actually think complexities theory and systems thinking is highly underused in museums. I actually wrote a textbook that is based on using underlying systems thinking in museum studies. And so I think Elaine's right on, and I think you wrote either did a talk or wrote an article on complexity theory in museums as well. Complexity theory might be a little scary because it's complex, but it does have these principles that I really think if museums could learn a little bit more about it and adopt it maybe thinking from that perspective, they can do some of these things. They could really move forward with a lot of these ideas. So it's worth looking into. If nothing else, go to Elaine's article. Elaine, remind me if it's an article or a, I feel like I've seen it.
It's an article, and it's called The Importance of And, that Greg.
Right, that Greg was referencing.
And but if we go back to the Sufi presentation, which really was also seminal in the same way, which is that human beings have the capacity of holding more than one idea, even oppositional ideas, as part of the human frame. And in complexity theory, one of the simple rules is that very small things could cause very big radiating issues. So it's a notion of scale as small, not only scale as big. And this notion that Kabir is talking about, which is which is not rationalizing, but holding the human condition as a holistic sense, is, I think, one of the journeys that Aleph is asking us to go on in a practical way, which is how can we make that evident as a form of thinking within the museum itself? Or taking the beautiful object, how can we have all the pieces that Kabir has given us so brilliantly today at the same time, where people don't feel they have to choose one or the other?
In a way, Elaine, if I may, I think, empathy, that takes me back to the definition of empathy, or how we think that we are defining empathy in a certain way that, that may not be very useful actually, because I think it is often very linear and very sort of, technical. It really doesn't define the experience, like Kabir Dada said. And I think our friends at the Empathic Intervision, Lidaway, Niesing, and Catherine Train, and I think they're both here today, they have a beautiful definition of empathy. And what I learned from them is that, it is not just one thing. And it is essentially, empathy does not mean that you have to agree with the other, or you need to change it, but it is just holding space for the other. And I'm sure they can elaborate much better than I can, but I thought it might be helpful if we are thinking empathy as one of the portals through which we can start this journey. We also need to work on our definition of empathy, which I think in our reflections panel following this, we will have Susan Lanzoni, who will talk about the historical evolution of how empathy has been defined, and perhaps we need to redefine it for our needs for this time and for what we need for our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Elif. And Philip, I think you raised a really important point here in the chat box. Would you like to share it with us?
Yeah, it's just that I've always imagined that one of the problems with the world today is that people have the answers, and people are looking desperately for answers. And when you're frightened, you look more desperately for answers. And that the whole idea of art in my life has been that it doesn't provide answers or necessarily any comfort whatsoever. It can, I suppose, but that the point of art is to raise the most difficult, complicated, complex questions. And that, for me to leave a museum or a performance and not know, but wonder, be in awe, be confused, have a zillion hard questions is really the excitement of going and participating in art. I don't know if everyone is in agreement with that, or it has to be, but I'm also a licensed acupuncturist. So my background is in Taoism, and the interest of not just opposites, but always opposites shifting, always things in constant flux, always things being in a dynamic interrelationship. So that it's an always changing thing, which I think also deepens this notion of questions, because nothing is static. I'm just curious what people think of that.
I mean, isn't that one of the symptoms of Western society and our colonial structure is our inability to recognize that we're not secure, that things are always changing, and that we are ultimately responsible for our own response, which is a deeply kind of spiritual practice that you have to learn, reflect, get new information. And I find that culture panders to the lowest common denominator. I mean, and so, you know, we are battling consumerism, materialism, binary thinking, either or, and people react with their reptilian brain when they're confronted with new information.
And as we're talking, I believe Alexandra Sharon, you are in our audience, and we had such a great, wonderful experience with you sharing your art and your film and your filmmaking process that is very much about identity and looking in and looking out. I wonder if you wouldn't mind spending a couple of moments talking about that and reflecting on it as we're having this conversation. And while we're waiting, I see Brenda, you have a comment. Is something you want to add here in our audio chat?
Hello, everybody, and goodness, because I'm not an expert and I don't teach, but I'm a practitioner, and it's just, I'm listening to all of the incredibly thoughtful comments, and a lot of it just so happens to be encapsulated in a Taoist philosophy and in Taoist practice and yin yang. Just FYI, it's not about edges. It's very much so what we're talking about when we talk about complexity and whole person and whole being, and the fact that we are constantly experiencing change. So I wanted to just sort of shout out to Philip, actually, for the helpful language that you provided. And I think that if museum experiences could operate more like that, I mean, I'm just preaching to the choir, but it's just some more language and thinking for everybody. If you wanted to dig into that, you'll find familiar friends. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Brenda. And as you say that, I'm recalling, Elaine, some writing and a conversation you and I might have had many, many years ago about how important the words we use are, how important the language is that we use in defining, describing, reflecting on any experience, cognitive, social, or emotional experience.
I'm struck that we understand Kabir's presentation in its theory, and we understand this notion of emotion and heart as a way of thinking, and yet we do not know on a more practical level how to translate that on a human to human. We are in the business of speaking to each other. That is the business we're in. And while we integrate in our head, we have no models, or not particular large models, of how to make that possible, how to welcome people who hold different ideas, who are looking at the same object, and taking away from that what Philip has suggested, which is what they need in a complex world and their questions without our imposition. And so, if I might, Greg, could I ask Kabir to talk again about what he is listening to us here and what his suggestions about next steps for us might be?
Thank you, Elaine. Well, I'm hearing a lot of things, and in responding to Philip's comments, let's agree that there is a way to leave space for our uncertainty and not to let certainties preclude or obscure uncertainties. But I would raise the question of, what are we certain about? Is there nothing we're certain about? And by certain, I mean, what do you trust? What do we trust in ourselves when facing our human experience? Have our years of living on this earth and years of education and professional life left us only with uncertainty? Or is there a dimension of certainty that is an open-ended certainty rather than a closed certainty? Certainty need not be dogmatic. Certainty could also be, some people trust life. Some people, because of their life experience, are extremely distrustful of this whole setup and live with a kind of anxiety. Some people, despite everything they've experienced, live with a kind of faith and trust that is not just a lullaby they tell themselves, but it is a rock solid foundation about the nature of reality itself. So I think we can have a balance between an open-ended uncertainty, and when we look at a piece of art, we can say, I don't really know what the artist meant, but let's see how my own deepest knowledge or my own deepest experience relates to what is being offered to me. So, yeah, that's, I think, enough of a response for the moment. I mean, we're trying to, all of us are searching for something, for some experience of value, of something that will guide us in how we respond to the ever-changing conditions of life, to the joy and sorrow, to the grief and happiness. What in all of this is a constant, if anything? Or do we live in or do you accept the postmodern theorem that it's all relative, that it's all a matter of subjective interpretation? When I read Rumi, can I just use Rumi as a kind of mirror for any opinion that I might have about anything? Or might Rumi himself be an answer to something? Might he be embodying a truth, a reality, even while, as we've seen, he incorporates this wholeness, these conflicts, all of the colors of life. You know what I'm saying? Is there anything essential about the human being and the human being's experience, or to propose that there's something essential? Some people would dismiss that out of hand. In postmodern theory, you would dismiss this, I think. But people who love culture, people who love beautiful art and music, people who see in other human beings something to be admired and to be longed for, what does that tell us about our humanness? I'll stop there.
Kabir Dede, I also would like to expand this conversation to our environment and how we treat our planet. And often, when we talk about museums, we often talk about art, but there's also, the natural history museums that talk about the evolution and how our planet was formed and all the minerals, and they tell us a certain story. How can we, and I'm just posing this as an open question to everyone, I guess, how might we involve some of those qualitative aspects of reality and our interpretation of our planet or our existence in this universe. Where does love come from for an animal if you don't want to harm it, you know?
I'm going to share a very brief thought. And I was visiting a great peace worker. He was the professor of international studies at American University, Abdulaziz Saeed. And he asked me the question, what is the ecological function of the human being? I had no idea what to answer. I mean, it could have been some easy answers, but I really wanted to know what he would say. And he proposed, he said, the ecological function of the human being is love. I'll leave you with that thought.
Well, I know we have a couple of our colleagues from the West Coast, from the Seattle Aquarium, and a really rich workshop that we engaged with earlier this week. I wonder if you all might have some comment here as we're talking about this topic.
I think it's interesting that when we talk about thinking of each other as humans, as people, in this idea of oneness, we do sometimes separate or elevate ourselves above animals, right? As if we are not animals ourselves. We are all animals, human animals. And so I think that there is an interesting opportunity for places like zoos and aquariums and natural history museums and art museums. But we're working with the Seattle Art Museum right now about an exhibit on our ocean planet, but to help emphasize though that sense of community and oneness and similarity. And so I think that there's definitely interesting different ways that we can approach this, because zoos and aquariums have traditionally held animals as kind of objects, scientific objects for appreciation. And even in a conservation context, sometimes we think about it as it's our responsibility to care for the animals as if we're doing it altruistically, when in fact caring for animals in the environment is in fact caring for ourselves. So those are some thoughts that pop into mind.
And I would like to respond to this by saying that it is the very nature of the mind, the brain, to view animals and even people as things. And it is of the very essence of the heart to view human beings and animals and trees and even minerals as something more than things, but as animate, as something animate and part of an animate reality. This is what I'm trying to say by the heart. It is that capacity within the human being that does not objectify and create things and others, whether it be, the heart that is dead and numbed can only see things, even when they're, posed with people. And likewise, this mentality that turns all of nature into just things makes things exploitable, puts dollar signs on a tree. But the heart knows otherwise. Your human heart knows otherwise, and your heart tells you this.
Thank you, Kabir. And Brenda, I appreciate you reminding us about the role that children's museums play in all of this, that children's museums are not always focused on objects or art or things, that they're more experience-based. And Kirsten, please jump in here if you'd like as well. And so if we think about children as human animals, then the experience of a children's museum is about investigating that lived experience, that through play, through emotions, through sharing. So I think that's an important component here. And Kirsten, you also added a really powerful statement about the role of love. Why don't you go ahead and share that with us?
Sure. Oh, I would I would love to, and I know Elif probably agrees with me on this. We've talked about this before. All I just said was that I've come to believe that the purpose of museums is or should be love. The end. Like to me, that just, I don't have more to say than that. It opens up everything, everything.
And I love Monique, really lovely heart work instead of hard work.
Oh, I love that.
Although I might argue that heart work is probably hard work for many of our institutions. Otherwise, we all would have been doing it all along. So,
actually, Greg, that might have been a typo. I was saying head work. And so what I'm encouraging us to do is to connect to here instead of here. And that's one of the things that museums, as a museum professionals, do really well, is they live from this intellectual curatorial space and they don't acknowledge the wisdom of what's in the heart.
thank you. And I will also say that it is hard work too. So
and
thank
it's
you.
Hard work.
So thank you for your typo. Brenda, you have something to add here?
Elif, why don't you go ahead?
Go ahead, Brenda, after you.
Oh, you're so kind. Thank you. Yeah, this is such a wonderful conversation, and to underscore the children's museums thing, I worked in children's museums for many years, and all of society plays out in the classroom and in children's museums. And I think so much of this conversation, spending time with children and spending time with children in thinking about whole person and thinking about like as I'm watching the chat thread and also listening to folks, one of the things that we need to prepare ourselves for with museum work in general, to do the heart work, which I could not agree with, Kirsten knows very well. I could not agree with more. Our job is to always be very mindful, though, of what intimacy means, what vulnerability looks like. And, you know, our asking people to be vulnerable, and our institutions asking people to feel uncomfortable in a lot of different ways, because a lot of heart work also involves that. And so I just wanted to sort of throw that in. I think we have a wonderful chorus here of people who are very much so, I would imagine, resonating with these ideas. And I think about not the tall order just for museums, but the tall order of our expectations for our visitors, to be able to feel like that in our institutions. And it is a form of mindfulness and practice. I was telling Kirsten, I think that museums need to walk softly as we love and as we provide for love. And I think that sometimes we don't walk very softly with the best of intentions. And please don't look at children as my side note. A lot of this conversation, children don't have a lot of the, generally speaking, challenges with love, in my experience, and in museum settings. They'll go there. They'll give it, baby. They will so give it if you offer it. And it's a good place for us to look and to think, is actually with children. That's all.
Thanks, Brenda. Anne Fullenkamp, I see that you're in the audience and you provided a comment. I wonder if you might share a couple of words with us from your experience at the Pittsburgh Children's Museum.
Sure, and thank you, everyone. It's been just a wonderful couple of hours to listen to everybody. But yeah, I echo much of what everyone said, and I think what I'll say is just remember that how we can kind of reach back into our inner childhood, and that, you know, kids really are smart and in a lot of ways very in tune to their emotions, and there's a purity and joy in how they go experience the world and ask questions, and are learning all of these topics and issues that we take very seriously. And like we were saying earlier, kind of get into our head, but they really do lead with their heart and in the real experience, and looking at the people that are with them in a very real time, in the moment, and being intensely present in the current moment. And just for us as adults to kind of learn from that and take how they experience the world seriously, and maybe we can kind of try to capture that and learn from them as we, you know, try to grapple with these issues too. That play and child's play shouldn't be taken lightly. that it's serious work.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Anne. Elif, I think you wanted to add something here.
Yes, thank you, Greg. And I was thinking, we are so impatient often, right? We want results. We want to see examples. We want somebody else to have done it before us so that we can go ahead and learn from them and, improve on it. But it seems to me this conversations, we are going into this sort of new exploration in a new space, new place. Not that, some of these notions have not been mentioned before, but perhaps it is that, time cycle of 26,000 years is, hitting us. And we are in this sort of mode of awareness of our, capacity, humanness. And I was thinking also, in our institutions, we often talk about, long-term strategic planning. And they're often, I guess, the longest, and, some of our museum directors can talk better about this, but 5-year, 10-year, or even corporations, right? But what Kabir Dede presented us with was this sort of 26,000 years of cycles. We are talking about human evolution in our journey to capture our true humanness, what we are made of and what we can be when we are combined with love and when we access those qualities that are already there in our hearts as love and compassion. And talking about that, long time frame and the cycle of things, I would like to ask Kabir Dede for his thoughts on what he might recommend. How would you advise that we frame the timing of things? Our roles now, with what we know, what we can do as individuals in different professions, different stages of life. Is there something that we each can do now to let us learn, like a friend said, walk softly, or figure out our ecological function of being a human and discover the love?
Well, this is what we've been talking about, Elif. I would summarize it by calling it the education of the heart. And we're confronting trends in our societies today, chiefly what I'll call the transhumanist agenda, which actually believes that we could download the information of our brains into a computer and live forever. Is something missing in that concept? And yet this is a real challenge, not to be underestimated. I can't underline this strongly enough, that the time to both know, understand, explore, and ultimately defend our human possibilities is now. And it's a work we're all involved in. All artists, all truly great artists, composers, literary figures are drawing upon this hidden treasure of humanness. And they're showing it to us in various ways. And we need to mine this treasure. We need to, evaluate this treasure. We need to understand it and understand for ourselves what is to be preserved. And ultimately we can say, yes, if the ecological function of the human being is love, that's a powerful, immense statement. Practically, what does it mean? I don't see it as a sentimental proposition. It's not to make everything nice and rosy, but to understand that love itself is that capacity that holds opposites together, that can embrace and comprehend this whole human situation, and the fact that we are living in a sense, we are living in an unlovable world, but not only unlovable, it's also lovable. It is both. But there's a capacity in the human being that can hold even these opposites and use science wisely, but not allow the, shall we say, the mechanical function of mere thought to dominate human life, not to allow the technological, automatic processes of mere thinking to dominate the nuanced, unifying experience of the heart. And the brain, the mind, our articulate capacities are important for articulating that knowledge of the heart, that wisdom of the heart. So every human being who's not a psychopath, every human being who is relatively conscious and relatively healthy emotionally has a lot of wisdom to draw upon. It's innate in us. It's intrinsic to what we are. And isn't it extraordinary that this exists in this universe of cold atoms and subatomic particles, that there's something else going on which the human being experiences as the wish to even sacrifice ourselves, the wish to act even when it's not in our individual self-interest, the possibility of living for the sake of beauty and not just money, and so forth. So this is the treasure of the human being. Let's explore it. Let's know it. Let's reinforce it in each other. Let's affirm it.
Kabir Dede, thank you so much. And thank you all for such an engaging conversation, which really feels like just a warm up for what we will transition to in our reflections and panel discussion.